Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Magellan discovered New Zealand. Who is Magellan? Magellan was a Portuguese sailor who worked under the Spanish crown. He was considered a traitor by the Portuguese. He is mostly known for having led the Spanish expedition to the East Indies, and his remaining ships were the first ships that completed the circumnavigation of planet Earth. Magellan wanted to work at first for the Portuguese crown, but the crown rejected his plans, and that's why he went and asked for the support of the Spanish crown. Yes, he had some criminal offenses, so that could also probably have played a role. The Strait of Magellan between the South American mainland and Tierra del Fuego is called after him because he was one of the first recorded persons to sail in that part, and his main objective was to find a trade route that would connect the New World with Asia. While he was able to do so, he unfortunately died in a battle in the Philippines in 1521. And this is an important detail for this alternate history. So let's keep that in mind. The Philippines in those years were very divided and not a unified country. Some parts had a great portion of Chinese influence, but other parts they were part of the so-called Indosphere, and last but not least, Islam became also very important and spread quickly on the Philippines. And let's not forget that the Treaty of Tordesillas was in effect, which means that technically the Philippines fell under the Portuguese sphere of influence and not the Spanish one. And yet the Spanish people, they took the Philippines. However, we noticed that parts of Australia and basically all of New Zealand are part of the Spanish sphere of influence if we were to respect the Treaty of Tordesillas. So what if all of that changed? What if Magellan discovered New Zealand instead of the Philippines? Magellan, he sailed from Tierra del Fuego up until the Philippines, so with a few changes in the weather or the winds, his ships they could have been blown to New Zealand. This would already bring in a very important change. And that change is that Magellan probably won't die in a battle. He may actually be very well alive for some more years. While I'm not saying that the Maori, they will just let the Europeans show up because Tasman's men, for instance, were attacked by the Maori people, I still think that there is a high probability that Magellan will not die in this timeline around. The Spanish, even if they went to other places, still somehow managed to trade first with the people, so they would find an area in New Zealand where they could just do that. Detailed maps they would be made, explorations would be done, and also some people may even stay in there and found some little colonies, because the climate of New Zealand would be perfectly fit for that. New Zealand in this timeline could be called San Lazaro Mauria, an alternate name because of the Maori people, or New Zealand would become the Philippines of this alternate timeline. The journey would then continue to Australia, where if we would respect the line of James Cook, the Spanish would meet the Turuwal or Eora people, which are Aborigines. And perhaps at first the Spanish would wonder if they already landed in Africa, and instead of calling them Indios, they would call the Aborigines maybe at first Africanos or Los Negros. The Spanish very often just borrow native names or words, and as a result Australia could be either called Turuval, Era, Tierra del Poniente as well, because the lands are west from New Zealand. Australia too would still be a candidate due to the Terra Australis expression, or we could also get some terms that have to do with Africa in the name. That could be something that has something to do with Africa, yes. And I know I keep insisting on Africa in here, but just let's be honest here. You have to imagine that these people who never really saw any aboriginal groups, they would then show up in Australia, and they would see people that, for them at least, who maybe have not really met many people from Africa, they would look like Africans to them. I mean, let's be honest in here, there is a reason why parts like the West Indies, they are called the West Indies. And this is most likely for human mistakes. With Magellan staying alive, he would spread the knowledge, and more detailed maps would appear earlier on of that region. Spain would then over the years develop their colonies in there. New Zealand would become a very popular destination for Spanish farmers, and haciendas they would be formed. The caste system would also be adapted in there, and the Maoris they would be placed in the same way as the Indios, while the Aborigines they would suffer and be placed on the same spot as Africans, for instance. At first, Australia would be largely ignored until Spain would discover gold and precious metals in there. And that's when suddenly a lot of attraction will happen. Many people will go, Spain will be more interested, and I believe with the relatively huge size but lack of population, Australia and New Zealand, they could become not only very white but very Hispanicized as well. There would also be a large group of mestizos in New Zealand or mulattoes in Australia. Another important aspect would be the focus of Spanish exploration in the Pacific, and Spain would then discover plenty of smaller islands such as the Easter Island, Pitcairn Island, which both they could function in a similar way as the Canary Islands. This will have, however, a very sad effect. Unfortunately, with the development of these islands, it would bring a huge loss of culture, assimilation, or even borderline genocide of the native people, as well as the complete disappearance of the Rapa Nui language. What about the Philippines? The Philippines in this timeline could be a bit more exposed to the Portuguese influence, Dutch influence too, but at the end the Brits would end up taking the islands for themselves. In this timeline, the Philippines, they would be maybe called Mai, Maith, or just the Luzon Islands. The Philippines would also be more Islamized, as the Spanish would never even convert them to Catholicism, and the Brits, they are not really known to be a big missionary state. So the Islamic missionaries, they would then continue, and a lot of the Filipinos, they would be converted to Islam. For many years, Australia and New Zealand, they would be staunchly pro-Spanish, due to the huge influx of Spanish, European and white immigrants. And even with the Napoleonic Wars, I don't see how these colonies they would even think of breaking free from the Spanish influence. And I mean, if the Philippines didn't do it with a higher population and a non-Spanish one on top of that, why would a Spanish population and a small one on top of that even try to challenge the Spanish rule? The only time where I could see some change happening would be in the Spanish-American War. The US would not just take over the Philippines as they did in OTL. No, they would actually instead take over New Zealand and maybe even Australia. New Zealand would have a high chance to become an American state. The people in there did agriculture mostly, they were white, and they could potentially be integrated like the Californios or Tejanos. Australia would be a very different beast, and we would have a higher mulatto population there as well. The Aboriginal people would once more be the victims of it, because being part of the US would mean that segregation would still be a thing, and they would be put in the same category as black people. Many changes and many modernizations they would be made, but due to the long time of Spanish rule, the system of this alternate New Zealand and alternate Australia would just be very bad, and I don't think that these parts would develop in a similar fashion as in OTL. A huge change we would see would be World War II. In World War II, Japan may actually rethink about attacking the US. Not only would the US not just have a port in Hawaii, but they would also have one in Australia and New Zealand. Yes, in OTL they had the Philippines, and I don't think that it really made such a big difference, and it didn't actually stop the Japanese from doing what they needed to do. But I think in this alternate timeline it could bring an important change. However, the US could get involved again, and most of the world would be the same, only that the Philippines would be more Islamized, divided, and in the Commonwealth, while New Zealand could be something similar to Uruguay, and Australia would be something similar to Argentina, but under US rule. Independence movements may exist, but they would not gain much traction, as it happens with Puerto Rico. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.